Okay, so this is the third talk in this series on basic principles of Buddhist psychology. And last time we looked at attachment, and the time before we looked at conditioning. And this time we're going to look at a particular and very important species of conditioning, which is the way in which the mind is conditioned by its object. Mind in Buddhism is very much conceived as a perceiving sense, really. In Buddhism, we often talk about the six senses. So we have seeing, hearing, touching, smelling, tasting, and the mind. In Western terminology, we usually think about five senses and think the mind is a different type of element. But in Buddhist psychology, they talk about the sadayatana, and the six senses. And it's interesting that ayatana literally means uncontrollables. So the six senses are the six things that are uncontrollable. Very interesting. Anyway, that's for a different talk. So the mind is a sensing object, sensing function, sensing process. And it always has something as its object. When we're conscious of something. And in fact, there are even implications in the way that Buddhist texts express things that imply that Buddhists assume that even in deepest sleep, the mind still has an object. We might never become wakefully conscious of that object. So this is an interesting speculation, not something that anybody can ever test. But mind is defined as having an object. So the Buddhist sense is that the mind is in itself clear and cognizing. It's always cognizing something. And this is not totally unlike phenomenological philosophy. This principle is very simple. You look at something and it gives rise to a state of mind. The mind is, in this sense, ultimately a bit like a mirror. The mirror has no opinion about what it reflects, but objects appear in it. So that, in a sense, is like the fundamental idea of the mind. But the mind in practice is not like a mirror. In practice, the mind is always coloring because of the many other forms of conditioning of the mind. The object is not the only form of conditioning. So the mind colors the objects that it sees. It puts a spin on them, shall we say, a twist. So the manner of relating to an object matters. I can show you this in this way. So the state of a person is a function of their relatedness to an object. Remember, of course, not the only way that the mind is conditioned, and the relatedness is itself conditioned by other forms of conditioning, our history, and so on. But the state of a person is related to, is a function of their relationship to an object. So you can see the basic principle here. If the object changes, then the state will change. New object, new state. New object, new state, like this. So if you change a person's environment, then their state of mind changes. A powerful application of this in the therapy world is the issue of how drug addicts frequently recover while they are in the clinic. But when they go back to their normal surroundings, they, in something like 90% of cases, relapse. So the state of their mind, the state of their being, their whole identity, in fact, is a function of the object, the situation, the circumstance that they are in. You change the conditions and you change the person. So this is with the drug addict, this is an example of how changing the environment changes the mind. When I was a social worker, one of my jobs was to make reports for the court on children who were in public care, children who had been taken away from their parents for one reason or another. And periodically, the court had to make decisions about this. And I, as a social worker, had to make a report. And to do this, I would visit the residence where the child was living. And I would ask the staff there to give me a description of this child. And I would also go to the school that the child attended, and I would ask the staff there to give me a description of the child and his behavior and so on. Now, if I had several of these children and I put the school reports in one heap and I put the residence reports in another heap, I would defy anybody to match up which ones belong to which child, because the descriptions I got from one situation quite different from the descriptions I got from the other. The child at school and the child at home were almost two different people when you wrote down a description in this way. Another example of how changing the environment changes a person. Another commonplace example that we're all familiar with is what happens when we go on holiday. Perhaps we can't do it at the moment, and perhaps that's part of the stress of the situation. But people, when they go on holiday, they become a different person for a week or two. And their cares and difficulties drop away. And at such times, good things can happen, bad things can happen. I've had clients who had psychotic breakdowns when they went on holiday because the environment was not the environment that they're used to. And another example, of course, is the disruption caused to elderly people when they are taken into a home. Quite often, people with quite difficult conditions have lived for many years in a stable situation and gradually deteriorating. And sooner or later, they can't manage. Living here in France, in my case, it'll probably come sooner rather than later because the situation requires a lot of effort. But still, yes, they are then, with great compassion and concern, removed to a residence where they can be looked after and their meals cooked for them and so on. And then 6 months later, they die because the change of circumstance has changed them markedly. Of course, this is not the only way that a change can occur. You can also get a change by changing the way that you relate to the same object. Psychotherapy is often concerned more with this form of change, which I'll represent like this. So here, the first state is a function of relating to an object in one way. The second state is a function of relating to an object in a second way. The third state is a function of relating to the same object in a third way. The classic example that is given of this in the Buddhist texts, and you have to imagine yourself in India for this really, the person is having a bath and they get out of the bath and they put their foot down and they feel something under their foot. And their first thought is, this is a snake. And at that point, their blood runs cold, and in a flash, they imagine a whole disastrous scenario, having just stepped on a poisonous snake. And then they look down and they see that what they've actually stepped on is a hosepipe. And at this point, their whole feeling changes, and they go through a few moments of very difficult adjustment, because they perhaps have, their blood has run cold and now they have a sudden feeling of great relief. But it's difficult to make this adjustment. Nonetheless, you can see that the two states are very different. You can imagine yourself in this position, and you can see that state B is very different to state A. But the object in this case has stayed the same. It's still the same cylindrical object on the floor, but the way of relating to it has changed. Now, each of these object relations in a way, implies, therefore, an identity, and it implies, in a sense, a whole world. When we imagine ourselves in one of these situations, it's a whole world of existence. Now, in psychotherapy, what happens is that a client comes and tells a story. And in this story are embedded the important objects of their world. Many of these are people, their spouse, their parents, their children, their friends, their boss, their school teacher, whatever. The important people, the significant others in their life, form the characters in the story that they tell of their situation. And they, the therapist, if you're following this, this approach, the therapist needs to keep track of the important objects that the client presents. Very often the first person or first object that the client mentions may be particularly significant, even if they then gloss on to something else. So firstly, the client, the therapist is imagining, recording, making note of in their mind the objects that are important to the client. And they're also noticing, just by observation, the state that arises in the client with each of these objects. In this way, the therapist is getting, you might say, a kind of map of the client's mentality. Now, what happens in a lot of psychotherapy is that the therapist notices the client's state and notices that the client's state changes when they mention a particular object, when they talk about their mother, or they talk about their spouse, or they talk about their enemy or their friend, the client's state changes. And quite a lot of psychotherapy these days is really focused on feelings. So at this point, the therapist, in a different way, depending on what school they've been educated in, he's likely to say something along the lines of, and how is this for you? Or what are you feeling now? Or I see you're feeling something, tell me about it. Or if you just stop a minute and look inwards, or something like that. Now, you can see that what actually happens here is that when the therapist does this, the therapist might think that they are not being leading, but in fact, they are directing the client to change the object, because the object now that the client attends to is the client's feeling. So object 2 is the client's own feeling, whereas object 1 was the object that was giving rise to the feeling. Now, this often has the effect of changing the client's state. And so the therapist feels rewarded because they have, by their intervention, brought about some change for the client. And it may well be a change that is towards greater calm. So the therapist now feels that this is a success. They've made a successful intervention. But actually, from a Buddhist point of view, this may be not the best thing to do. It may well be that it would have been better to have kept the client's mind on the original object. The client's feelings, their state, would then perhaps intensify, but would stay related to the first object. And one would then gradually find out more and more about how they relate to that object. So instead of saying, so how are you feeling now? Or how is this for you? The therapist might say, oh, tell me some more about your mother. What's her name? Tell me, how old is she? And how does she view you, and so on. By a series of little prompts, it's not really that the therapist wants this information that they're asking for, but the therapist is keeping the client's mind on the significant object. And as long as the client's mind is filled with the significant object, they will explore that relationship. And it may well be, especially if we're talking about an object with which the client has long familiarity, like mother or spouse or child, then it may well be that the client will, in assembling the vast amount of information that they have about this significant other person, they may well experience a change of state. They may shift from viewing the person one way to viewing them another way, because typically, if I ask you to talk about such and such a person, the first things that you tell me will be perhaps things that relate to one significant incident in your relationship with that person. But that won't be the whole story. There'll be a lot more that you know about this person. If I keep your mind on that person and show interest and encourage you to talk more, you'll assemble that other information. And very often what then happens is a shift. Now this shift is more enduring than the first kind of shift. The kind of shift which is just a shift of feeling when the object changes can easily be dispelled when the object comes back again, when the original object is restored. But if one changes the way one construes the object, this may well be a more enduring change. And it's also quite a good way to work, because the client is, generally speaking, less defended in talking about an other, an object, than they are in talking about themselves. If you direct them to talking about their feelings, well, they have feelings about feelings. Some of their feelings they feel ashamed of. Some of their feelings they feel proud of. Some of their feelings they feel angry about. Some of their feelings they feel frightened of, and so on. But in relation to an other, they are less defended, relatively speaking. So often the work is easier, and it has more similarity to ordinary conversation, even though the therapist is taking note very carefully of the changes that the therapist perceives. And so the object, in Buddhism, we refer to it as rupa. A rupa is an object that has some power. some effect upon you. And so originally the word rupa meant the object of worship. And so we talk about a Buddha rupa, we mean the statue on the shrine or the symbol that is on the altar. And so we can think of it in this way if we like, that in a certain sense, there are many rupas in our life, many things that we worship in different ways. Perhaps we worship money, perhaps we worship status, perhaps we worship a certain position in life, and so on. And these are all situations, they're situational, they relate to particular objects. Certain objects stand out to us. Perhaps money stands out to us. Perhaps things that symbolize sex stand out to us. You're reading a page of print, certain words jump out. Perhaps the words that relate to sex or money or your identity. These are all significant objects that have some power. Of course, the principle can be applied at much lower, more trivial levels. We might worship coffee. The people who run coffee shops are well advised to have a fan near the door that blows the smell of the coffee out into the street. Because when people are walking along, they smell the coffee, and that immediately puts them into the mind of being a coffee drinker. And before they know it, they're going through the door of the shop, ready to spend some money. And the coffee shop owner has achieved his purpose. And so you can attract people by presenting them with particular objects that trigger them into a particular state, a particular way of being, which then implies a particular behavior and a particular identity. So I've covered some of the basic thinking about how we are affected by the rupas around us, how we relate to them, how that can be relevant to our everyday life, how it can be relevant in psychotherapy, and how we move from one state to another. Buddhism is quite strong on the idea that we don't have a fixed identity, that we shift from state to state depending upon the conditioning. And we try to maintain a certain stability by hanging on to, by attaching ourselves, which is what we talked about in the last talk, by attaching ourselves to particular objects and particular constellations of objects. This gives our life a certain solidity, a certain predictability, and our own feelings a certain predictability, so that we start to feel that we know who we are. When in fact, this is probably not really the case. If circumstances change drastically, suddenly, if we were in Beirut last week, then everything would change. And suddenly all the things that you took for granted would suddenly not be there, or would have changed in some drastic way. You would also have changed. When the objects around you change, you change. When the way that you construe the objects changes, you change. When the person who you'd always believed to be your enemy turns out to have been quite helpful to you in some way that you hadn't realized, and suddenly you realize it, and then you start to think of them as your friend, not only does your attitude to that one person change, but your attitude to life as a whole changes. You suddenly start to feel safer, more expansive. Of course, the opposite is also true. If you discover that somebody you've always regarded as a friend has betrayed you, then you start to feel insecure and your whole world changes. Your relatedness to an object implies a world, and it implies an identity, and it brings forth a particular state.